if they want their culture to exist in the future, i.e., if they want, let's say, gender egalitarian cultures or cultures that are okay with gays existing in the future, if all of those cultures are below repopulation rate, those attitudes just simply won't exist in the future. If cultures that give women a choice around reproducing, if all of them go extinct, then those attitudes aren't going to exist in the future. So we try to tell people, hey, you need to make these decisions yourself.
Malcolm Collins, welcome to Times Radio.
Hello, I'm excited to be here today.
You certainly sound excited. Look, for listeners unfamiliar with your work, how do you define pronatalism, and what sort of led you into this worldview?
The pronatalist movement is about trying to bring attention to the long-term consequences of falling fertility rates. However, it is not about increasing the world's population forever. That's a bit like hearing somebody's fighting global warming and imagining they're Mr. Freeze wanting to freeze the planet. It's more like, no, there's this line here and it's going to have some long-term consequences if we don't address it, given the way our society is currently structured.
Who are these long-term consequences for? Are they consequences for society generally? Are they consequences for individuals?
The consequences are going to be most felt by the most vulnerable individuals in society. And they are going to be felt by many of the most vulnerable groups in society. So if you look at one of the big core problems with demographic collapse, it's that a lot of the world decided to build their economies and social services like a pyramid scheme. And you get something called a dependency ratio cascade, where a larger and larger portion of the population is living off of the government dole. And when this gets too large, one, you get problems for democratic states when the majority of the population is living off the government rather than paying into the government. They never vote themselves less money. And so things begin to break down. But you have the secondary problem, which is obviously systems start to break down. In the United States, that starts with Social Security, right? I think it's called something different in the UK, which is basically keeping old people alive. But because that's always the last system we allow to fall, welfare is going to fall before that. Medicaid is going to fall before that. The NIH is going to fall before that. And so a lot of these people, and everybody knows this, like if you look at the math, I can go to like a progressive person and I can be like, you see that these systems aren't sustainable, in just a few decades. And they can see it as well as I do. And so I'm like, why don't you care the people who are going to suffer when these systems start to collapse? And I think it's just a different in mindset. Do we care more about like sort of human aggregate well-being, or do we care about human well-being in the moment?
Okay, but I mean, so in my own case, sorry to take this personally so quickly, but look, I have two kids. If I'd had more kids, I'd have had to move to a different area. My wife would have had to been forced to park her career at least for longer, so we'd have been economically less productive. We'd then also have been bringing more people into the world who may need to rely on government subsidies and require government intervention. How would we be helping? Who would we be helping? I don't think we'd be helping ourselves.
So the probability that your kids end up contributing to the tax system versus living off of the tax system is directly tied to, more than almost anything else, whether or not their parents were contributors to the tax system or whether their parents were taking from the tax system. While we have tried our best to build an economic and societal education system where this isn't the case, we just, after a century of trying, just haven't gotten there yet. And so this actually makes the problem of demographic collapse much worse in many countries. Because in many countries, and this is actually changing in Europe right now, so we can talk about this, but the less money you make, the more kids you have. And so if you look at a country like the United States, where this is still very clearly the case, it means that, in X many years, if you're just calculating America as having like a 20% lower or 30% lower young population, you're actually doing the math wrong, because people in like Mississippi and Alabama are having way more kids than people in like Manhattan or San Francisco. And so the actual tax paying problem is going to be much worse. This isn't a problem of warm bodies. This is a problem of taxpayers. Recently in Europe, especially in countries where you have high amounts of social services for the unfortunate, fertility rates have actually collapsed more among lower income individuals. And so this is really a fascinating phenomenon.
Okay. Why solve this problem through natalism, through more births, rather than through immigration? Because immigration's a lot cheaper. If you encourage more immigrants to come to your country, then you're not paying for them when you're children, but you do take advantage of them when they are productive adults. Why isn't that better?
Well, one, I don't think it's ethical. I think that, right now, if you're looking at Europe, right, and you look at the, progressive plan to resolve this, i.e., the fact that a bunch of white people are going to be living off of the government, and it is to import people from Africa, because that's really the only above repopulation place in the world reliably anymore, to support a non-working white population. And I know that it's not like directly as bad as it has been historically, but I think that planning to live off of somebody else's sacrifices and labors, that these people's parents, as you say, you'd have to live in a worse environment if you wanted to have a lot of kids. And a lot of these people's parents did make sacrifices to live in worse environments. So there's that. But then the secondary problem is it may not even work. In some countries, it's very effective. So in the United States, our immigrants are actually like much more economically productive than immigrant populations in Europe. And this is because you cannot really have porous borders and heavy social services, because then, like osmosis, the people who need the social services the most are disproportionately likely to immigrate into your country until your country can no longer pay those services. So you're much more likely to get immigrants who are drains on the system and actually lower the timeline you have until collapse. But then the secondary problem is you don't just have the dependency ratio cascade problem of demographic collapse. You also have the problem of a local population eventually being replaced. And this isn't a problem as much in a place like the UK, but let's talk about like Italy, where you have a fertility rate of like 1.18, and Spain is around the same fertility rate. In these countries, at their current fertility rate, even if it doesn't continue to fall, for every 100 existing citizens, there's only going to be 20 great-grandchildren. That is catastrophic. And if they are bringing in immigrant populations with a much higher fertility rate than them, you really only have one of two potential scenarios. Either you completely culturally convert the immigrant population to being Italian, right? That is what we historically called cultural genocide. That is taking these cultures' kids and making them have exactly your culture's values while erasing their ancestral values. I think that that is unethical. The second outcome is that they end up replacing the pre-existing population. Now, I think that fears around this are really overblown if you're in a country like the UK, or even France or the United States, but I don't think they're overblown everywhere.
Okay, but I mean, you can understand. So a lot of the criticism that people with your worldview come up against is that this is white supremacist. This is far right, and I mean, and what you're talking about here, you're basically talking about preserving white America, aren't you, in your own context?
Not at all. In America right now, this year in the United States, from preliminary data, it looks like the black fertility rate in the United States has fallen below the white fertility rate. If you look at Hispanic populations, the lowest fertility rate state or territory in the United States is Puerto Rico, which is basically our Hispanic majority one. Mexico, by Financial Times reporting, fell below the United States in terms of their fertility rate this last year. Collectively, depending on the stats you're using, Latin America may have fallen below the United States fertility rate. And so, like, let's even think about this from the position of like an American black. So the American black, like if you break out the native-born American blacks versus the immigrant American blacks might have a fertility rate now of around 1.3, which is like desperately low. And the black fertility rate in the United States is kept high by immigrant black populations. Have we lost something if the American black population and culture goes extinct, and is replaced by immigrant black populations? I mean, I think we have. Like, I think that this is, have we lost something if the Korean population goes extinct? One of the interesting things about falling fertility rates is the most resistant populations to it, like to prosperity-induced fertility collapse, are Northern Europeans and Jews. And some of the most susceptible populations to it are often native populations like Native Americans, and East Asian populations, and Southern European populations are also very susceptible to it, which include Hispanic populations.
Well, I'm speaking as a Northern European Jew. It's good to know I'm doing my bit in that case. Look, allowing that this is a problem and that immigration isn't the answer, what then do you do? Because countries like South Korea and Hungary, they've poured lots of money into baby initiatives with really limited success?
This is really an interesting question. Both sides, whenever they hear about this, they have these intuitions, which is we just need to do more of what our side is all about. So leftists will hear this and they'll be like, well, we need to make housing cheaper and we need to do government handouts. And I'm like, Hungary spent 5% of its GDP on this, and its fertility rate now it's as low as it's ever been and went up less than its surrounding neighbors for cash handouts. If you look at Israel, houses in Israel are like orders of magnitude more expensive than they are in the United States, and it's denser, and yet their fertility rates are much higher. Northern Europe has great, social programs, and yet its fertility rate is below the United States. So that doesn't seem to be the case. But then a right winger will come up to me and they go, I know what we need to do. We need to, ban pornography. We need to ban gay marriage. We need to ban abortion. We need to severely restrict immigration. And I'm like, congratulations. That's been the legal system South Koreans have been living under for about the past 2 decades, with I think the abortion ban being lifted in the past couple of years, but that's kind of irrelevant. The larger point here being is that didn't help them in South Korea. We know that these things, actually, if you look at Europe and you look at the fertility rate of countries by the level of restrictions on abortion access, the more restrictive they are on abortion access, the lower their fertility rate is. Fascinatingly, you also see this around feminist issues. People will say, oh, well, it's the fault of women entering the workforce. And yet throughout the 90s, the female participation in the Indian workforce didn't increase, and yet their fertility rate dropped like a stone. And Arya Babu in the UK did a great study of this in Europe, where she looked at how gender egalitarian views were and showed that within the EU, the more gender egalitarian a country's views were, the higher their fertility rate was. And you can even see this if you look at high fertility countries. If you look at the countries that are prosperous and unusually low fertility, like South Korea or Japan or China, they're typically highly gender egalitarian. You look at the ones that are very high fertility, like Australia, the United States, and Northern Europe, and Israel, they're typically very highly gender egalitarian.
Yeah. Okay. But so what is? I mean, how are you going to encourage people to do this? I mean, because because your own situation, enviable to many as it may be, I've looked where you live. With respect, Malcolm, you live in the middle of nowhere. It's easy for you. You live in a big house in the middle of nowhere. A lot of us don't. A lot of people don't. People live in cities. They live high cost lives. How are you going to do if this isn't about state intervention, giving people more money to have more kids? How does it happen?
Well, I think it happens at the level of the movement itself, motivating people to make intentional choices themselves. If they want their culture to exist in the future, i.e., if they want, let's say, gender egalitarian cultures or cultures that are okay with gays existing in the future, if all of those cultures are below repopulation rate, those attitudes just simply won't exist in the future. If cultures that give women a choice around reproducing, if all of them go extinct, then those attitudes aren't going to exist in the future. So we try to tell people, hey, you need to make these decisions yourself, right? And when you talk about like my choice to live in the countryside, like I could have lived in a city. My wife has a graduate degree from Cambridge and I've got one from Stanford, right? Like I could go get some high paying job in the middle of the city, but we made this choice to make our lifestyle affordable. And it's the same with, people will be like, oh, cost of living crisis in the United States. And I'm like, look, you're Irish, right? I know your ancestors because I've read about the way the Irish immigrants lived just 2 generations ago. They'd live like 4 families with like 30 people living in one like tenement in the middle of Manhattan, right? Like there are ways around this, but it requires changing the ways that we live and the ways that we raise our kids. And that requires individual cultural experimentation. It's very hard, I think, fortunately, to force people at the government level to have kids.
I'm not sure I necessarily want to share my house with another 5 or 6 families or with 6 or 7 kids, but hey, who knows? Maybe that's the future. Look, part of the sort of the areas, the cultural areas in which your movement has gained a lot of traction are both in tech circles, in Silicon Valley, and in parts of the American right. What is it about what you're saying you think that appeals to them?
It's fascinating. I mean, I could go really deep. On our channel, we often talk about the anthropology of the political realignment that's happened in the right, both within the United States and more broadly. But the core reason is the leftist parties, both in Europe and the United States, have sort of become the parties about enforcing the dominant culture, what we call the urban monoculture, on a very diverse set of cultural practices. By this, what I mean is if you look at high fertility cultural groups, whether they are like Amish people or like us or like Elon Musk or like evangelical Christians or ultra-Orthodox Jews, they're all very weird, culturally speaking. And this is weird where their weirdness is their distance from the dominant cultural group, which is now the urban monoculture. Now, if you go back to the 90s or the 80s in the United States and in the UK, the Conservative Party was the party of the dominant cultural group, which was the Judeo-Christian cultural group. That's not really the case anymore. That group can't win elections on its own anymore in either country. And so the conservative movement now is largely made up of everybody who wants to resist the sort of cultural pressure, be that both legalistic, in the UK, like arresting people over offensive means, or within the school system, or anything like that, that is trying to enforce a monoculture on the population, which is why you get this huge array of diverse populations. If one of the reasons fertility rates are falling is because of the culture of the monoculture, right, which we argue it is, this idea of you should live your life in search of pleasure and self-affirmation, then all groups that are trying to be high fertility are definitionally antagonistic to the monoculture.
Are you not living your life in search of pleasure and self-affirmation? It sounds to me like you've
Not
got
at
a vision
all.
for your life, and you're fulfilling that absolutely.
No, I think that's quite a bad way to live, and I think it's even mentally unhealthy a way to live. There were some statistics by the CDC in the United States that came out a few years ago showing that among young people, 1 in 10 had made a plan to kill themselves on any given year. Like that's a cultural disease that I am scared to send my kids to. I live my life completely in dedication to making the world better for the next generation, like to improving intergenerationally, improving myself every day and improving my family and the species with every generation. That's what I try to live for. But pretty much anyone who's a pronatalist is living for something other than themselves, because it is a sacrifice. Like when you're having 8 or 9 kids, you're no longer getting marginal personal hedonistic benefit for the additional kids that you have.
Finally, then, Malcolm, tell me how many kids you've got, and tell me what your average day looks like. How much do you sleep?
Not a lot. I'm probably cutting into my life here, but I'm getting extra kids. I mean, my wife is taking a bigger risk than I am. So we just had our 5th kid. Our oldest kid is 6. So we've been having about 1 a year. My wife is to do everyone with a C-section. So, the world record for C-sections is 11. We're hoping we can break it. Like our sweet spot for kids is 12. But something could go wrong. And then we're going to have to reassess our fertility plans. In terms of our average day, wake up, get the kids ready, spend time with the kids while we're working, do our podcast. I don't know. It's like I'll tell you what, I spend a lot less time in terms of like the impact on my life parenting today with 5 kids than I did when I had 1 or 2 kids. Like I think nothing is harder than having 1 or 2 kids because you treat them like they're little princelings, right? You chauffeur them around. They're always doing some fancy thing. They get a new toy. My kids today, it's like, oh, you want a toy? Let me go to the attic. I'll get one your brother had like a few years ago. Oh, you want to go to the whatever? Well, there's no way we can do that for 7 kids, so I can't do that for you. It's about reassessing norms around, what it is to have a lot of kids. Like when I get them dressed in the morning, what I'm doing is we have one set of like buckets of clothes for different age ranges. It's all exactly the same outfit, just different sizes. And as they get older, we just change what bucket we're reaching into to dress them.
Look, I know I said that was the last question. I've got one more. If your wife comes to you tomorrow and says, you know what, I don't think I want to have any more kids, is that the end of the conversation, or is that the start of a new conversation where you try and convince her otherwise?
I mean, obviously I would be like, what happened? Like you've been driving a lot of this for me. I would want to understand why. Like our marriage, we have a marriage contract and it's structured very explicitly. Like we have a goal, right? And our goal and our marriage is dedicated to this goal rather than either of our individual happiness, which is, intergenerational improvement and improving ourselves every day. Like my dedication to my wife is helping her improve as a person, her dedication to me. So what I would ask her is, what new piece of evidence do you have that's changed your view of this?
So you'd try and talk her out of it. You'd try and talk her back into
No,
having
I'd
more
want
kids.
to understand. I mean, if she's changed her mind, that means that either she's undergone some sort of serious like head trauma, or she's encountered new evidence or new logic that I hadn't considered and that I should be integrating with my own worldview. Like if she is a logic,
or she's worried about the continued health implications of more and more cesareans.
Right. If she thought that was an issue, I would be worried as well, because if she dies, I'm raising 5, 6 kids alone. Like You know, I say I'm not about hedonism, but that sounds really difficult. If she had serious concerns about that, I would be very open to listening to her.
Malcolm Collins, thank you so much for your time. Fascinating. Good to have you with us on Times Radio.